Hello, and welcome to the Regrettable Century. It's us, the dudes. We're all here today to talk about Hegel and whether or not Hegel is still relevant to the socialist left. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. I mean,
Okay.
we kind of talk about Hegel on and off, like often, but at least this one time, maybe we're going to do it a little bit more systematically. Maybe.
Yeah. Well, we'll go into it with the intention of systematically thinking and talking about it. Whether or not that happens is between God and our subconscious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go. Perfect.
And I would
I'm
add
just going-
that whether or not Hegel is still relevant to the left or anyone after the end of history.
There we
Yeah,
go.
actually, that's a better way to put it. So what I was thinking about for this episode was like, because we talk about Hegel often, or we have talked about Hegel at several different points over the last, I don't know, 5-6 years almost.
We're going to start year 7 in November.
Yeah, which is kind of wild, actually.
It is wild that we've been doing this for that long.
Right, and so like, it's a little bit difficult exactly to extract sometimes what is unique and actually important about Hegel's thought, because a lot of people just think like, oh yeah, Hegel, because I'm a Marxist and so I'm for Hegel, because what they really mean is like they're like in favor of some version of what they're kind of what I think that a lot of people think is meant by a dialectic, because they just like Marx is also dialectical, except for he's not idealist. So like I want to talk about, I think what we should be thinking about is like trying to resurrect Hegel and Hegel's thought for our time, and like to not just treat Hegel as like a distant precursor to Marx, like the way that like the Iggy and the Stooges might have been thought of by like the early punk bands. Because I just think that that's too limited, and it's so limited that it's just not true. Like if that's your approach, then I just think that you don't treat Hegel and his thought, and that means you don't treat really early Marxist thought seriously. So I wanted to read a little bit of a quote from one of the articles, because I just think it kind of frames that first point. It says that both Marx and Hegel found the dominant scientific method of their time, which is the method of physics with its static laws, to be inadequate for capturing the logic of social transformations. Hegel was the first to turn to the dialectical method, whose origins go back to at least to Plato, and use it to capture the logic of these historical leaps, while at the same time systematically developing the logic of the dialectic itself. And I feel like that's kind of the most important thing. It doesn't stop. Once Marx steps onto the scene, the value of Hegel's thought and what it means to actually incorporate that into your own thought, it doesn't stop. You're not like free of having to think dialectically. And whether or not there's a meaningful discussion that we should have about like the absolute versus God, or if they're the same thing, panentheism versus pantheism, spirit versus, or what spirit might mean, I think that's all like, that's related. I think it's important. But I think the main thing is just that like, there's some utility to understanding Hegel on his own terms, and I just don't think we do that.
Right. Well, that's one of the articles that we read in Jacobin is Hegel still an important thinker for the left? Sort of dismisses Hegel's theism as he says that God and religion are creations of the social conditions, and I'm like, I know for a fact that Hegel does not think that.
Right.
Hegel still very much believes in God. So that was kind of like a, if we're taking Hegel on his own terms, right, that's one thing that we have to reinsert, is rather than putting what we wish Hegel was saying onto him, and by we, I mean the left. If we just wish that Hegel was a rational atheist bro like all the rest.
I was listening to a lecture by a professor somewhere in the East Coast. I forget his name, but he was discussing Hegel, and he was making the same sort of point about how Hegel's whatever Hegel means by the absolute, he doesn't mean the Christian God. And he to prove this point, he pulled out the quote that the absolute is I forget the exact quote, but something along the lines of it is the development of human consciousness in history and in society, or something along those lines. And he uses this and he used that as he made, in fact, made the point that he uses this quote in conversations with other people who say that Hegel is a Christian, as a gotcha, as a proof that Hegel's not actually a Christian. And then he went on to say something along the lines of, there's a question as to whether pantheism is distinct from atheism in any manner. I don't think it is. And but either way about it, Hegel's trajectory is clearly toward secularization of society. Right. So I think that is just such a wildly fundamental misunderstanding of Hegel that it belies somebody who presents themselves as an expert on the subject and probably has spent more time thinking about it than me, who clearly just has no idea what the fuck he's talking about. Because, I mean, to take that position, you would have to take the conclusion by mere assertion that pantheism doesn't actually count. It is nothing but a transitional phase from Christianity or theism to atheism, and it's actually just atheism in disguise, and nobody actually means it. And it also takes Hegel's account of what it means to refer to God and what God is to be a childish thing, an uncomplicated, naive representation of what God is, and then says, "Well, so he clearly doesn't believe in this naive version of God, so therefore he's an atheist."
So was he saying that Hegel was a pantheist or a panentheist?
He didn't discuss the distinction between panentheism and pantheism. He just sort of left it at a sort of hand-waved pantheism away and then moved on with the lecture.
Well,
the lecture wasn't concerned with this. This was just sort of a little stopping point.
Because if you remember back in our Hegel and the Hermetic Tradition series we discussed the difference between panentheism and pantheism, and Hegel is a panentheist, not a pantheist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Meaning that the earth is part of God. Not that all things are God, are part of God, but the earth is merely one part of God, and that there is much, much, much more to it than that. Right?
Right. There's a podcast I listen to sometimes called the Cunning of Geist, and there's a discussion about the evolutionary nature of the universe itself is not just as a matter of for organic phenomenon, or not just for living beings, but even all of everything in the universe is in a state of becoming, so to speak. And so,
I think that is the most crucial. I mean, if you were to put a bumper sticker together, that would be it. Of here's Hegel's becoming.
Right, exactly. And so the thing is, if you think of God as something really simple, simplistic, and childish, so that you can knock it down, then Hegel's not a theist. Hegel doesn't believe in God. If you think of God the way that Hegel talks about God, as a Lutheran, then I think you have to if you just take him seriously, take him at his word, you have to believe that what he says is what he means, and it makes it more clear anyways. And that also kind of that distinction about what idealism is another one of those things that I think that if you try to make it into something really simplistic and something childish, so that you can set up and knock it down, then that makes everything that Hegel says just harder and harder to understand, and makes it less and less clear.
Mm-hmm. I feel like just to the bogey of idealism is coming from, so the way that positivism, which in a sort of prototypical way he was contending with in his time, Hegel was. You referenced that earlier with the science of his day. Right. Positivists are actually the ones that are looking at idealism as just the inverse of themselves.
Yeah.
Idealism is just, I wish things would be arbitrarily this way, as opposed to being arbitrarily, quote unquote, progressive. It's a total misunderstanding of that's actually the things that are at odds, not Marxism and idealism, but positivism and idealism.
Yeah, I remember whenever I was a younger radical, and I was like being taught about Hegel, and the way Hegel was presented to me was that he was an idealist, and an idealist is a person who thinks that what happens in the world is purely a matter of whether or not people think a certain thing, and so we're materialists, and that means that we think it's a matter of what's possible given the material conditions, and neither one of those things are true. I mean, well, they're very inadequate. I think there's a better way to understand what the German idealists were trying to get at, especially Hegel, and also what it is that I think is a meaningful understanding of materialism and material circumstances. So like when Lukács is talking about when ideals become material force, that's kind of what is getting back to what it is that idealism in the Hegelian sense is actually about. Because
hey, it's not like Hegel never took account of what he called Wirklichkeit, actuality or reality. It would be another way of translating that.
What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational.
Right. Yeah, that's not something you could just say like as a person who thinks that whatever you wish is what will be.
Right. I mean, like Hegel is very much so a rationalist, but he thinks that you can use human reason to understand what rationalists would generally consider to be the irrational.
Right.
So Hegel says you can reason your way to understanding God by reasoning facets of God, right?
Yeah, because that's what absolute knowing is. That's what it means. It means that the entire universe is intelligible, and that is not an argument against God. That's an argument against a limited conception of what it means to reason. It's an argument in favor of reason. It's as one of the forces at work in the natural world, in the human world. It's like there's gravity and whatever, and there's reason, and that it makes it's much more complicated and much more interesting than we have been led to believe.
Well, and also so two of these Jacobin articles, they're both reviewing this same book by Richard Bork from 2023, Hegel's World Revolutions. And then the one Chris brought our attention to, Hegel is still an important thinker for the left. The writer says, for Bork, the most vital part of Hegel's thought is the rejection of both our ability to turn back the clock or to wish away the legacy of what has already happened. And so in that sense, that's essentially what positivism is doing. And that's why it sort of sees an inverse, the inverse of itself in what it deems idealism. But that's not at all what Hegel was arguing.
Right. I like the next sentence a lot. He says, instead, politics and philosophy must look unapologetically forward and find what Hegel described in his Elements of the Philosophy of Right as the rose in the cross of the present.
Right. The rose in the cross of the present.
And so when Hegel talks about like the confrontation with the moment of truth, when you have your ideas and you're going to actualize them. So that's when say the French Revolution is when you could say that like philosophy is being enacted upon like in a mass social way, but that not everybody agrees. So there's this confrontation with the moment of truth, and that means there's going to be conflict.
Well, just before that passage we were reading, the author of the article is responding to philosophers who are he deems them the post-war anti-Hegel insurgency. Nietzsche, Heidegger, Adorno, Derrida, and Foucault. And he says the last three, who are nominally left figures, wish to recast human emancipation in individual terms as personal self-actualization, escaping a disenchanted present without engaging what Hegel would have called the labor of the negative. And I think that holds true for a lot of the Marxists that sort of trained our consciousness.
Yeah.
For a lot of
Yeah, for sure.
the liberal, I mean, there's a total abnegation of understanding history.
Right. I mean, there's this understanding of history is just a series of steps forward,
Yeah.
and that history is not actually a slaughter bench in the way that Hegel refers to it as, but actually it's purely a matter of when people act in material ways based on what is possible because of the development of the productive forces and nothing more. And their ideas are only developed after the fact, which is really weird, and it's almost a semi-Hegelian way of discrediting Hegel. But actually, it turns out that I'm working my way around to conceding a point to you, Ben, because in the last couple of months, been really kind of knocking my head up against this thing you have said a couple of times about how like everything matters, that even just ideas matter, even if things aren't possible, and even if things aren't really working out quite the way that we want them to, you still, just engaging in whatever limited way makes things move forward, and that has a value on its own terms. And as much as I want to disagree with that, I don't think I can anymore. I think you might be right, and that's part of what motivated this. Was like this episode was like, this is Ben's whole argument.
Oh, I didn't realize that was what we were talking about.
Well, I mean, not exclusively, but that's like one of the first things I wanted to just get out of the way. Is like, I don't want to be disagreeing with that, and then also at the same time arguing for the cunning of reason, and for the if the path that we wanted to go down in the last 100 years seems closed, it's not necessarily the case that the way to reopen that path is just to go back to a better way of doing things and start over, because we can't do that.
Yeah.
And so the only other, if the only way out is through, then that means, I think, in this era, in this moment, what we're going to be doing is mostly making emotional and intellectual appeals as we try to figure out what we're doing. And we're going to be doing things which are very often, materially speaking, they feel wrong and stupid sometimes.
Yeah. Would opening up the very best of French champagne in honor of Bastille Day during the Restoration be included in these sort of acts that seem to not matter? I find great. I don't know. I'm able to position myself in history better when I read about how much was lost to the disappointments of the French Revolution, and later after Hegel with the 1848 revolution. Like, history is so meandering. It took so long to get to 1917. It was never a stairway to revolution.
Right.
Yeah, and then look what happened after 1917.
Exactly.
1917, like 1848, and like, the French Revolution, were sort of spasms that like lurched history off of the tracks and onto a different trajectory.
Yeah.
And nothing was guaranteed with those spasms, those ruptures. Nothing was guaranteed. I would say that within those moments, there was the potential for the utopia that we talk about and dream about, but also the dystopia that we live in now. And clearly that's where we ended up. And I think that like with 1917, it was more of like, rather than putting us on the path that we're on now.
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe to try to put it more dialectically would be to say that, 1917 was the antecedent to the world that we live in, but not purposefully.
Right.
We live in this world that is downstream of 1917,
But the whole purpose of 1917 was to prevent the world that we live in.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, we definitely have, pieces of the world created by 1917 that linger as farce.
The rise of what the USSR turned into, the appearance of Mao on the world stage, the different regimes that Mao and Mao's successors supported around them, for the better parts of them as well as the worst parts of them, are part of what constitute the world, the hell world that we currently live in. Is the ability of the status quo to hold up the worst aspects of the consequences of 1917 as the inevitable horrors that come from trying to change the world for the better, is part of what constitutes the world that we currently live in.
Sure.
And we
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
wait,
yeah.
we
Sure,
can't
sure,
pretend
yeah.
like that's otherwise. So that's what I mean by the world that we live in is necessarily, whether intended to be or not, downstream of 1917, for better and for worse.
Yeah, exactly. It's for better and for worse. And that's really important because I think one of the things I think we've all basically arrayed ourselves against this notion of this linear trajectory of history. And that's falsely attributed to Marx, but also falsely attributed to Hegel. So when we come up against this era, which seems where there's not currently anything on display which speaks to us and says this is an example of the way forward or clawing toward the way forward. There's this tendency to say, Hegel was wrong. I don't see that in Hegel's thought and his philosophy. I don't take, like Fukuyama, I don't think that this is the end of history and it's really good. And this is proof that Hegel was right. I think this is just a new era. This is just a moment. And upon reflection, it's going to look different than it does right now. It doesn't make Hegel right. It doesn't make Hegel wrong. It just makes it's almost like it's unrelated, really.
Right.
We're not living in the synthesis that has been resolved?
No. Right. I think that simplification that helps to sort of give an entry point to Hegel, which is presenting his thought as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. If you that can be a helpful way to communicate. Here's where a way to access Hegel's dialectic. But if you stay there, you end up in this. If we stay there at thesis, antithesis, synthesis, then we get a very unanimated picture of what there is and what the dialectic means, which is precisely what Hegel, I think, is chiefly trying to shake us out of,
right.
Which is this view of the world as a thing that is or ever can be captured by a supposition, a postulation that the absolute is unintelligible, but every piece of the absolute is intelligible, and we can only ever approach the absolute by continuing in a dialectical process of aggregating experience of parts and pieces, particularities of the absolute. That if we ever find ourselves in the position of thinking that we have arrived at the correct point, we have been captured. If we have ever think that we have arrived at the end of history, then we have been captured by this very thing that Hegel is trying to shake us loose from. At the same time, I don't think that I think his very own sort of example that he set with his own life and positions that he took on things. I don't think that conversely committed him to the position of refusing to take strong stances and advocate for things very strongly and say this is right and that's wrong. He very clearly, manifestly did commit himself to things, and he believed that he found I understand the trajectory of history. I understand the spirit of the world, of the times, zeitgeist, and I am a champion of those things. I think that what he calls us to do is to stop trying to be things that are essentially striving toward understanding, and rather calling us to be things that are striving to be actors, to be agents.
Right. Yeah.
That there is, against the ancient Greeks who were obsessed with the antagonism of being and not being, he posited that what essentially is becoming.
Right. That's the secret third thing. But also, Kevin, what you're talking about right now is why it's so important to recognize and acknowledge that Hegel's theism is not a metaphorical. Because what you talked about earlier, these simplified dialectical terms of these two opposing this material or ideological concept and this one, they're opposing each other and they have to clash and then they merge and synthesize. That's not what Hegel was trying to talk about at all. He's actually talking about the logic of the absolute working itself out in our own experience. So like, they're not separate concepts they don't arise separately. Like two different things from different parts of the world, and then they clash together. A better way to understand it would be like when you listen to us talk about right now, and we're like struggling to find the way to say what we're saying, that's what is being experienced in the world as well. The dialectic is not two separate parts clashing with each other. These are the same thing.
No.
Okay, so when you read Capital, the proletariat is created by capital. It's not like an outside force. Capital is a dialectical relation. The proletariat is a dialectical relation. It's not like over here there's the capitalists, and then over here there are the workers, and they're going to a mass force, and they're going to come together. Like they happen at the same time because of each other. It's all one thing.
In that sense, his theism is at least in part or in large part materially founded.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
it's a totality you can observe.
That's why in this outline I put idealism in quotes versus idealism without quotes, because I feel like that matters, that we recognize that Hegel's idealism is not what we call idealism. Hegel's idealism is what we call, well, it's also not what we call materialism. Hegel's idealism is probably more like what materialism should be, and vice versa.
Oh, Kevin,
and that's
quickly,
that's why Ben is sort of right.
I wanted to say that you referenced becoming, and I'm looking at the other book review article. This one is titled, this one is about Hegel in the era of wokeness, or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
And he references how failure is central to Hegel's understanding of progress. So there could be no becoming without failure.
Yeah, Hegel was a fail-forward kind of guy.
He says he didn't see history merely as a perpetual motion machine driven by impersonal reason and churning through a dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So, yeah, you can't actually get to that without all the things Chris listed earlier, the failures of revolution.
Yeah.
Stalinism. It's just like there's a brutality to it as well, but
that's kind of why I think that our forays into this decadence discussion over and over in different pieces is not at all, it shouldn't be counterposed to our understanding of the old Marxist phrase that revolutions are the locomotive of history, because it's like there's a way in which that seems like what you're saying is that it's upward and away. It's all a linear trajectory. But also, I just don't think that I don't think that that's true at all. And I don't think that Hegel thinks that. I don't think that Marx thought that either. So that makes me kind of one of the questions I wrote down was like, can Hegel's optimism speak to modern society? And I think I basically just said yes. I mean, it can, because I think that that question it's lifted from one of the articles. I forget which one. But I think that Hegel's optimism is a really simplistic way of understanding what Hegel is trying to get at.
It kind of depends. Like, I don't think so if we're reducing it to the Samuel Beckett line that Zizek likes to quote, fail better, I think that has limited use.
Or
Yeah.
if it's limited to the sort of Steven Pinker-esque understanding of the linear trajectory of history, like arcing towards progress,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Because that's the caricature that people make of Hegel when talking about Hegel, right? Like
Right.
in the academy, historians who do a 6-week long class on a historiography, 1 week includes positivism and teleology, like heavily teleological historiographies, which includes Whiggish history and Marx. And they always say, well, Marx was a Hegelian and Hegel is a incredibly teleological thinker who believes that things unfold according to a formula and that history is always trending towards progress. And then that's the most that historians deal with Hegel before they move on. And I spent a good 15 minutes arguing against that in class, and everyone was just like, okay. And then they just moved past it without talking about it at all. But anyway, so yeah, that's like in the academy, that's how Hegel is dealt with, unless you're a philosopher, right?
Right.
Right. That's kind of the way that how Freud is dealt with in psychology, just kind of consigned to no longer relevant at all, just not
Right.
a part of the practice of psychology anymore.
Though Lacan is heavily Freudian, right?
I'm not sure. I think there's. I think I'm no expert here, but I think there's basically dueling schools in psychology of essentially behavioralism on one side and essentially Freudianism or psychoanalysis on the other side, and they don't like each other.
Oh, Chris, I was going to say, so the very little that I have read of Hegel, which is the beginning of Phenomenology of Spirit, when we were going to read it together, he explicitly says over and over and over again the exact opposite of a teleological view of history. And, the preface is 100 aphorisms, and he's saying that over and over and over again.
Right.
That's crazy.
Yeah,
It helps
I
if
think
you don't
I think
actually read Hegel.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I guess it's kind of like academics talking about Marx now. None of them fucking have ever read Marx. They're just talking about other people who assert things about Marx, and then they're just responding to those other people.
Well, right, because there's an ideological reason, there's an ideological project behind, or rather, I guess what I should say is that this is all part of an ideological project to disabuse you of any notion that you should think about things the way that Hegel thought about things, or the way that Marx thought about things, and that you should only think about things the way that that serves what's already being done, what's already understood as being the right way.
Right.
You should think about things the way that Steven Pinker thinks about things, not the way that Hegel thinks about things.
Right.
We read Marx, but it was sort of just like a precursor to Lacan, who is more important. Not Lacan, sorry.
I was gonna say Lacan's not a Marxist, or
That's
he's
a hell
not
of a class.
post-Marxist or anything. He's just
No, not Lacan. Other French guy, the
Foucault.
Foucault. There we go. As a precursor to Foucault.
Yeah, he's
who's-
way more important.
He revolutionized thinking about power by saying that power is decentralized, man. It comes from everyone around you. You're actually being oppressed by everyone around you constantly because you live in a society.
yeah.
I don't know. It's such banal horseshit. But what it does is it individualizes. It further atomizes everyone's understanding
Right.
of
Exactly.
the world, of power, of oppression. So it's 100% in line with the neoliberal project. So that's of course
Yep.
why it was taken up and touted as being
Exactly
so
right.
revolutionary.
Which I don't think that was Foucault's intention. I earnestly believe that he was trying to innovate something new or whatever, but it just happens
Sure.
to be that what he innovated was perfectly suited to the neoliberal world order.
Well,
I
it's like the
suppose-
rejection of Fordism was because of the monotonous sort of the rejection of the monotony and the monolithic nature of society, and wanting to be able to carve out a place of your own where you could flourish, right? So the impulse towards the dismantling of Fordism is positive, right? But within that, I mean, that's the result of like, trying to change ourselves without changing society. Like, I think it's a good thing to change yourself or whatever, but like trying to create utopia without actually changing the material conditions.
Right. And so like,
sorry, I don't know if you hear the baby in the background, but she's not having a good time.
Like, I want to talk about what, as young communists, what we thought of as flipping Hegel on his head to extract the rational kernel of his thought. And I think that that's incorrect. I think that that's a very limited way of doing, of understanding this.
Right.
There's a little bit more than just what we have understood idealism to mean.
What was that line you have about Foucault? Foucault has the line about Hegel. Hegel's always waiting.
Oh yeah, it's like try and escape him though we might. Hegel will always be at the end of the road waiting for us. Something like that.
I mean, I can sort of see how there was like an off-road from Hegel to get to Foucault's ideas about subjectivity.
Here it is. To escape Hegel involves an exact appreciation of the price we have to pay to detach ourselves from him. It assumes that we are aware of the extent to which Hegel, insidiously perhaps, is close to us. It implies a knowledge in that which permits us to think against Hegel of that which remains Hegelian. We have to determine the extent to which our anti-Hegelianism is possibly one of his tricks directed against us, at the end of which he stands motionless, waiting for us.
I mean,
but also like maybe that's just part of the absolute working itself out. Like, maybe we have to just go through this dark night of the soul, which is the post-Cold War and some might say post-communist moment. I would like to think it's not the post-communist moment, but I don't think we will know until after it's over. This is why I said a couple episodes ago that like I'm a communist because that was the last thing worth identifying with. But in a different era, I wouldn't be. One day there will be communism. I would be a Republican, and so on, right? And so I don't know if in the future there's going to be a thing which I would recognize communism as one iteration of, and that new thing is a thing. Whatever. I don't know the term yet. So for now, we're communists because what the fuck else is there?
I'm a Foucauldian because power is like everywhere, man. It's like a meta power that's like pervades everything.
You can see where all the hysteria comes from, and the like total just basket cases that abound in the leftist academy. You can't trust anyone, basically. Everyone
the fascist creep thing. The whole fascist creep is like a Foucauldian idea of power, right? Because you don't actually have to have a fascist movement that takes power if everyone is just, if this creeping fascism is getting its tendrils and midichlorians in everyone,
If the Hitler particles are just diffuse in existence, then we don't need there to ever be a concentrated moment of fascism. There just needs to be
Hitler
lots
particles
of fascism.
are like the fecal bacteria that flies all over your bathroom when you flush the toilet with the lid open. If someone walks by you wearing a Death in June shirt, they're just shooting Hitler particles all over everything.
Is that how fascism works? You flush the toilet and
the proverbial toilet. The proverbial toilet flushing would be like a post online that says, "I don't know, guys. Maybe we should consider both sides of this argument." Hitler particles everywhere.
So all you need for fascism, which is a mass movement, is individuals. That's all you need are individuals, and that's what gets you fascism. It's a wonder we don't have that now, because we got lots of individuals.
Oh, but we do have it, if you ask.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot.
Pretty much most leftists. Like, this is the Fourth Reich. The Nazis won. This is fascism. Right?
And also, America tends toward fascism anyways,
Right, that's true. Right.
So going back to Jason's point about no, this is it. I'm responding to what you're saying. I'm not turning the page.
Yeah.
So I was going to say earlier, like, so there's this retroactive claiming and reclaiming. So the left does that to whether it's like the Texas Rangers, and the Republic of Texas. That's fascist. And we can also say, yeah, that's fascist. So
yeah,
I mean,
Thomas Jefferson. It's all just fascism.
Yeah.
Right.
Everything that has yet been is only fascist. But eventually, through no effort of our own, there will be good things, even though we can't imagine there being good things yet, because we haven't had good things happen yet.
Wow.
Well, as long as we just keep voting for harm reduction, then, we should get good things eventually.
Yeah, but the missing part of that metaphor is it's like someone who's like it has their heart has exploded and it's impossible to contain, but harm reduction, we have to keep reducing harm reduction. At a certain point the patient will die.
Right.
I want to say something else about Hegel's idealism versus materialism, and how inadequate and I think incorrect that framework is. He says that through consciousness, spirit intervenes in the order of the world. This is spirit's infinite tool, and also bayonets, cannons, and bodies.
Yeah, the slaughter bench.
So another thing I want to talk about is just like this idea that we have that Hegel becomes conservative in his old age and becomes basically counter-revolutionary. So what Marxism has done is saved the dialectic from Hegel, because Hegel, he's like kind of reconciles himself to the Prussian state.
Because Hegel's idea of freedom is freedom to salute a policeman.
It's the Reich. That's freedom.
Who was that said that?
That was Rorty. That was Richard Rorty. No, wait,
right.
Maybe not. Rorty had that line about how they resolved the left Hegelians and the right Hegelians absolved the problem. Oh yeah, here it is. Rorty said that the left and right Hegelians had eventually sorted out their differences at a 6-month-long seminar called the Battle of Stalingrad. So smarmy.
It was Bertrand Russell who said the thing about Hegel's idea of freedom was the freedom to salute a policeman. Bertrand Russell, the Right Honorable Earl, member of the House of Lords, supporter of appeasement.
Another thing I really like is that in this Hegel is still an important thinker for the left article. He says that Bork, that seems like an incorrect pronunciation. Bork.
That's what Swedish dogs say.
Burke. Anyways, Hegel's world revolutions suggest not only that we view Hegel as a practical philosopher, but also as someone driven by this pragmatism towards a nascent version of social democracy. Indeed, Burke notes that some saw his influence behind the rise of the social democratic movement under the leadership of Ferdinand Lassalle. For Burke, Hegel's importance seems to reside in his ability to reconcile that a system of needs emerging in civil society proved compatible with constitutional liberty. Since necessity and freedom were not antithetical in Hegel, they could be dialectically reconciled. I just think that that's so far from, well, Hegel saw the end of history as the Prussian monarchy because he turned into a conservative in his old age.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the Hegelian method can be lent to many, many different ends.
Yes.
It doesn't, and none of them has complete claim to it. That would be ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, he also said that Africans were non-historic peoples, so that's another gotcha for the old conservative Hegel. But then Engels said that about the Slavs, right?
Hegel was also a champion of the Haitian Revolution. He thought it was a glorious moment. Because for Hegel, what matters is that freedom is... Because for Hegel, what matters is that freedom is becoming conscious of itself, that human beings are being put into action, and that spirit is animated in the world, in this human action. So what he means by historic peoples is whether or not that is presently happening. So in Haiti, freedom is actualizing itself. So
Yeah.
that's good. And in other places, it's not. That's
Yeah.
all he's really saying.
So it's a
And
political
according to
determination.
Exactly.
is it Susan Buck-Morss that wrote Hegel in Haiti? That was
Yes. Yeah.
that was his inspiration behind his writings about the master-slave dialectic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just very opposite. It's just unrelated to this biological / cultural and racially inflected ranking of peoples. Like these are good peoples, these are bad peoples because of culture, biology, whatever. That's a discourse that Hegel's not involved in. That's something that we transpose onto Hegel way after the fact, and he wouldn't recognize it, and I think he would argue against it if it even existed. Well, it existed in his time, but yeah, he would argue against it.
It seems like a deliberate mistranslation to the present.
Yeah.
But even if it's not, he is this consciousness of freedom that you mentioned. It is a universal, based on universal principle, which is a no-no in the sort of postmodern school.
Right. Like the idea that the West could come up with a universalizing good that the rest of the world didn't come up with at the same time is necessarily racist and Eurocentric, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, as if we can't take account of the fact that the West is positioned in a particular place in given history, the development of history and social interactions of if you want to allude to or appeal to Jeremy Diamond's theory of guns, germs, and steel as the reason that Europe invaded the rest of the world rather than vice versa. Europe was produced through material conditions, perhaps by actuality, by reality, in Hegel's terms, to be in a position of being dominant on top of the world and being infused with highly, forwardly developed, progressed modes of production, and hence developing social institutions around them, and having lots of people with lots of the capacity to spend free time thinking about things, philosophizing and that sort of thing, because they're very wealthy nations, that they're able to produce certain ideas conjoined to these social institutions, ideas around freedom, universality, etc., the Enlightenment ideals that Hegel was an advocate of, that he recognized came from Europe because Europe was positioned on top of the world, not because of any biological fact. Hegel was explicitly anti. This was one of his sort of very points of what he meant by idealism. He was extremely opposed to any objective categorization of consciousness on the basis of anything that can be perceived from the outside. That consciousness is nothing if it is not from the inside. It's not something that is given rise to by self-actualization, by self-movement and self-realization. And also Hegel's Christianity is critical here, because if you recognize that Hegel was a firm believer in his own understanding of what God is, but he regards the rise of Christianity and its supplanting of paganism as one of these moments, is world historic moments. Christianity doesn't come from Europe, comes to Europe,
right,
from the Middle East. It goes to Ethiopia before it ever goes to Rome.
Right.
And I feel like that's important also. It's critical to recognize that for Hegel, the rise of Christianity means a greater coherence between peoples. That's what he's celebrating. That's what he's saying. This is proof positive that greater and greater we are getting
union?
greater and greater union is happening because of Christianity and because of Rome.
Yeah.
Those things don't make him Eurocentric. Those things don't make him racist. Those things just make him celebratory of what we would call unity. And I guess if you are an advocate of this cultural relativism, and you say everything is equally good all the time everywhere, then sure, fine. I guess by that standard, I guess Hegel is an advocate of a monolith, because that monolith is the result of these disparate elements all coming together into greater coherence, greater union. Incidentally, it's also just what science is also.
Even like secular humanists would agree that Enlightenment principles coming to be the ruling ideas of society are just the decoupling of humanism from Christianity. Because previous
Right.
to the Enlightenment, Christian humanism was pushing the Christ's ideas about Christ and the Father, the Church Fathers, etc. Ideas about freedom and dignity of the individual, and the rejection of dominance and slavery and etc. that was spoken about by the early Christians. They would have said that all of those things have Christian origins, and the decoupling of those from Christianity is what births the Enlightenment. It's not that it's the decoupling of Christian identity from the dominance of the state, right? So that it can
Right.
move out into the world and influence society in ways that are beneficial to the people that it serves, rather than the ruling elites.
Which
Right,
is why
that's
he was such a partisan of the Reformation in that respect.
Right.
And
Right,
to
sure.
your point, on page 4 of the Wokeness article, it reads, "The career of Jesus Christ was the most moving and important example in world history of this conundrum. For Kant and Hegel alike, he was the first to see that a religion's moral code must be willed from within rather than imposed from without."
Right, because
Yeah.
for Hegel, the thing that you talk about the universal and the particular all the time, but that the mediating the third element of that triadic structure, which is the of the dialectical structure, I guess. I'm trying to imagine. I'm trying to, again. It's like I can't. I wish that the air around me was I could draw on it like John Madden, because I'm trying to draw my thought. But anyways, it's the individual is the way in which the universal and the particular are bridged, and back and forth, and vice versa. So the sentence right before what you just read,
Yeah.
Ben, it says morality might originate in individuals, but they exist in societies and states. This raises the question: how can individuals reshape political communities to align with, rather than obstruct, the exercise of our will to the good?
Right. But that follows the original recognition of Kant, right? That moral
Right.
injunctions are only recognized by human beings when willed by individual selves.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's you can see all of these parts that can be taken without taking the whole, and all the disparate conclusions that can be wrought.
Right. Okay, so then in the Hegel on Bastille Day article,
Right.
just on that note, the freedom of spirit is, for Hegel, embodied in this rational unity of a people. But a universal freedom does not come from thin air. It has to gather itself into this unity. It has to first constitute itself as a universal will, out of the will of individuals. And yet, people's will is not always transparent to itself. In other words, to use Hegel's language, it may still be trapped in its immediacy. And that's why history resembles that of a slaughter bench. There's a whole series of contorted twists and turns that we have gone through, not that we have to go through, that we have gone through, and that we're likely to keep going through, in order to work out what it is that our will even is, because that's what freedom is working out our will by ourselves. And that happens to also be a deeply Christian understanding of what it means to exist. Because people say things like, well, if God is good, then why is there so much suffering? It's like, that's our fault. That's our cross to bear, is to go through that suffering, come out the other end more conscious of what we can do, what we want to do, more conscious of our will, and more capable of exercising it to become like gods. That's the descent into heaven. That's how rationalist and atheistic Hegel is. Hegel believes that the Garden of Eden and the fall from grace is the fall upward into heaven.
I have a query of you all. So we've rooted Hegel to he can be clearly designated, as Jason has said, as a Christian, more narrowly as a Lutheran, a Protestant,
or more narrowly a mystical pietist Lutheran.
Okay, so speaking to the pagan and the two Catholics, how do we approach? Is it through the mystical that we approach? You approach Hegel, or are these just sort of historical things that they're just historical hanging on
Artifacts,
perhaps? Yeah, artifacts. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one, yes. I think the mystery of our existence is so speaking as the pagan here. I think the mystery of existence is one unifying aspect of what I can find with Hegel's postulation here. I think additionally, we live in a world that is deeply transformed from the one that Hegel lived in. I think that Hegel saw and lived in a world that was transforming toward a future of realizing the ideals that he found in his Protestantism for very important and specific reasons. I think we find ourselves in a world that has been transformed by that to such a degree that the universalization, the totalization of individualism has. We now live in the night in which all cows are black. Like everything has been so flattened out of particularity that I think that the striving toward the realization of the absolute is to be found in recapturing particularities that have been erased.
That's what Aufhebung means, right? Doesn't mean that this previous cosmology has been supplanted, now it's done forever. And so my Catholicism is not at all in contradiction with the fact that I deeply agree with, and find a lot of hope in Hegel's philosophy, despite the fact that Hegel and Catholicism are like officially opposed to each other. I don't have to be a Swabian pietist just because Hegel was, because Catholicism hasn't been done away with. It has been because of the Reformation. Catholicism is better.
I would say that the Reformation was like the bursting of an abscess. Like the Catholic Church was rotten at the time of the Reformation, and still contains elements of that rottenness, right? And I would say that like the Reformation was the bursting of that abscess. What sucks though is that once the abscess burst, all of the pus that came out of it started its own church. Right? So right. So I'm just kidding.
Well, right.
No,
so, like,
but
if Aufheben means to abolish and preserve and transcend, my Catholicism is an Aufheben version of Catholicism.
right.
I think the same thing can be true also of Protestantism, because I think just because you're Protestant doesn't mean that you are responsible for mega churches and the Watchtower and so on. You know?
Right. Or, Lutheran anti-Semitic massacres that happened during the Peasants' War and stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And let's be perfectly honest with the state of religion today it's about, equal to the state of our social movements.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
It's full of a bunch of atomized individuals who belong to their church the same way that most leftists belong to the left. and that is like as an affectation that they put on sometimes, and they're with no real connection to that community whatsoever. And the churches that these atomized individuals belong to are like on a long decline, are in sort of a death spiral, really, as they hemorrhage membership, because people are waking up and getting smart, and they're not stupid enough to believe in God anymore, and they're tired of the.
That's definitely not the case.
That's definitely not the case, because people are going from not believing in organized religion to just believing in like astrology and witchcraft and other things that are
dumb bullshit that comes across their timeline as
exactly
them by the algorithm. Yeah,
right. Like these what seems to me to be an epidemic of like weird sort of Black Hebrews that believe that white people were created by the devil and stuff like that. Like, I don't know if it's just because Jason has totally fucked my algorithms up by sending me a bunch of this stuff, but it appears that this is an epidemic that's plaguing the African American community at this point, and at the same time, just like QAnon, and then there's the alternative wellness sort of gurus that have the same type of sway over the minds of the people that follow them as a priest in medieval Europe would have. I mean, it's just like we haven't become a more rational,
right.
more secular society. We've just created new gods, new gurus, and new priests to follow that are way worse than the ones that came before them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think. Yeah, exactly. So I think that Hegel lived in a moment where capitalism was a progressive force in the world, and capitalist individualism and the Protestant work ethic were the advent of progress, and they were coming to sort of into the world in a manner to realize freedom.
He himself was a product of that. We would have no Hegel without that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think we all now live in that world of where the Protestant work ethic and capitalist individualism have been fully totalized in our society. And I think that the progressive role that they played in the moment when Hegel was alive has fully played out to its maximum capacity. So I think that were Hegel to reappear and look around the world today, I think he would try to strive. He would look for what are the elements of our current, social existence that would realize the forces of progress that aren't necessarily the same ones that he was realizing or was an advocate of in his time. So I think a truly Hegelian approach would never take a particular position that is taken in a particular place in a particular time as a universal absolute that must be advocated by all others in all other places and times. And so if we are to be truly Hegelian, we recognize that he was becoming, and so are we.
Right.
Well, like Hegel says, spirit cannot remain in a state of opposition. It seeks unification. And in this unification lies the higher principle, which is just what Kevin said anyways.
So that's right. That's the answer to you as to why Jason can be a Hegelian.
Oh, and a Catholic.
Yeah. No, my answer would just be, I do what I want.
Yeah.
Рабочие и крестьяне не смогут без нас некому будет установить порядок, определить работу, и труду. Без нас все развалится и государство распадется.